9 o'clock in the morning, February 19th, 1945. The ramp drops. A Marine steps off a landing vehicle and into black sand that swallows his boots to the ankle. He has less than a minute to get off the open beach before the mountain above him decides whether he lives through the day. Everything he is carrying on his body right now was chosen for exactly this moment, and most of it is about to fail him in ways nobody back at Camp Pendleton warned him about. The night before, the fleet sat off the coast of a volcanic island the Japanese called an unsinkable aircraft carrier. 8 miles long, mostly sulfur and ash, and home to 3 airfields, the United States needed to escort its bombers to the Japanese mainland and give crippled B-29s somewhere to land on the way home. 72,000 Marines were about to find out exactly what that island was going to cost. Marine commanders had asked for 10 days of naval bombardment before the landing, believing that much time was needed to find and destroy Japanese positions carved into volcanic rock. They were given 3, and the first of those was cut short by poor weather, but command genuinely believed the remaining defenses had been broken by the time the landing craft went in. They were wrong. The island's Japanese commander had ordered his men to hold their fire until the beaches were completely full of Marines and equipment. And the men climbing down the cargo nets that morning had no way of knowing any of it yet. The ride in came aboard amphibious tractors, 6 waves going in at roughly 5-minute intervals under a clear, bright sky with no fog or smoke to hide behind. Each rifleman going in on those first waves had already been stripped down to what he could actually fight with, because anything extra was just more weight to drag through what was coming. And there would be no going back for anything left behind on the boat. Many men were seasick from the circling and waiting before their wave was finally called forward, and every one of them went in already soaked from spray coming over the sides, carrying 60 pounds or more of gear on a body that hadn't had a dry moment in hours. The primary weapon was the M1 Garand, chambered for the 30-06 round, semi-automatic, and by this stage of the war standard issue across the Marine Corps. A full combat load rode in the M1923 cartridge belt, 10 pockets, each one holding an 8-round clip, for a baseline of 80 rounds on the belt, plus 1 clip already chambered and ready to fire. Many riflemen slung an additional cloth bandolier of 6 more clips across the chest before they ever left the ship, because 88 rounds sounded like plenty until the shooting actually started. Each rifle squad also carried a Browning automatic rifle, and the man assigned to it went ashore with several loaded magazines of his own, since his weapon was the one the rest of the fire team would lean on to break up a Japanese position. Each man wore the herringbone twill utility uniform, by this stage of the war often the reversible camouflage pattern the Marine Corps had adopted for the Pacific. And on his head sat the M1 helmet over its fiber liner, standard protection across every branch by 1945. On his back rode a haversack, packed with a poncho, extra socks, and whatever else fit, none of it comfortable, all of it necessary for however long the fighting lasted. Here is the detail almost nobody expects. Before the ramp dropped, a lot of these men had already slipped a rubber prophylactic over the muzzle of their rifle. It sounds like a joke until you understand the problem it solved. Iwo Jima's beaches were not sand in any normal sense. They were volcanic ash, fine as flour, and just as good at working its way into a rifle's action. A covered muzzle kept grit and seawater out of the barrel during the wade-in, and Marines pulled it off and fired straight through it if they had to. Reportedly, some units treated it as standard practice by this point in the Pacific campaign, though it was never official issue. Getting off the beach was its own fight, separate from the enemy. The volcanic ash rose in terraces up to 15 feet high, and it could not be dug. Marines who tried driving an entrenching tool into it found it collapsing back into the hole as fast as they could clear it, soft and shifting like loose coffee grounds. Vehicles fared even worse. Trucks and light tanks bogged down where they landed, some of them never moving again, wrecked hulks that later waves simply had to climb around. And men had to abandon equipment on the sand just to keep climbing themselves. No foxholes meant no cover in the traditional sense, so the Ash's one mercy was that it also absorbed a portion of shrapnel from incoming fire. The entrenching tool came along anyway, strapped to the pack, useful the moment the ground turned solid again further inland. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone landed with C Company on Red Beach 2 that morning, already a Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal, and according to his own request. Back in the Pacific by choice, rather than finishing out the war selling war bonds at home. When his company's advance stalled under fire from a fortified Japanese blockhouse, Basilone worked his way around its flank alone and destroyed the position with grenades and demolition charges, clearing the way for his unit to keep moving toward Airfield Number 1. He didn't stop there. Later that same morning, Basilone came across a Marine tank trapped in a minefield under mortar and artillery fire, and he coolly guided the vehicle back onto safe ground while the barrage continued around him. Shortly afterward, a mortar round found him near the airfield's edge. He died within the hour, having been ashore for less than 2 hours total. His story is one of the more thoroughly documented human moments of the landing, and it says something about what this day actually cost that a man who had already survived Guadalcanal didn't survive this one. On the belt or in a shoulder holster, depending on rank and role, sat the M1911 pistol in .45 caliber, backup for when a rifle jammed or ran empty at close range. Riflemen also carried the Kabar fighting knife, standard by this point in the war, along with the M1905 bayonet that fixed to the end of the garand, for the close quarters fighting the island's caves and bunkers were about to guarantee. Fragmentation grenades, the Mark II, hung from the cartridge belt or webbing, typically 2 to 4 per man in the assault waves. Iwo Jima's defense was built almost entirely underground, reportedly more than 11 miles of connected tunnels linking well over 1,000 rooms, bunkers, and gun positions that the pre-landing bombardment had barely touched. Grenades became one of the most used tools on the island for exactly that reason, since a position cleared in the morning could be reoccupied by defenders moving through the tunnels by afternoon. Specialist teams following behind the riflemen carried flamethrowers for the same job on a larger scale, clearing bunkers the infantry couldn't reach with a grenade alone. Though that weapon belonged to specific assault teams rather than the average rifleman going in on the first wave. Water was its own kind of enemy. Iwo Jima had no fresh water source of its own. Every drop had to come ashore by landing craft, and the island's sulfur vents meant the ground itself was sometimes hot enough to cook on. According to accounts from men who fought there, the M1910 canteen, 1 quart, rode on the belt, and running dry under Pacific sun on volcanic rock was a real and immediate risk, not a background detail. Halazone tablets went into that canteen to purify whatever water made it ashore, since none of it came from the island itself. Food came the same way, boxed K-rations of biscuit, tinned meat, and hard candy, small enough to fit in the uniform's oversized chest pockets and eaten cold more often than not. The M1924 first aid pouch carried a battle dressing and a packet of sulfur powder, meant to be applied directly to a wound before evacuation, which on this beach could take considerably longer than anyone wanted to think about. Gas masks had technically been issued for the landing, since doctrine still required it, but a significant number of Marines ditched theirs during the approach or shortly after hitting the beach. By 1945, gas warfare in the Pacific Theater was considered unlikely, and the mask was extra weight nobody wanted to carry uphill through ash. Attached to every Marine rifle company was at least one Navy hospital corpsman, carrying a medical bag rather than a rifle. And it was corpsmen like these who did most of the work. The first aid pouch on a rifleman's belt could only start. Iwo Jima was especially hard on corpsmen, since treating a wounded man under fire usually meant exposing yourself in the same open ground he had just been hit in. By nightfall, the men who had made it off the beach were digging in wherever the ground allowed it, setting up listening posts, and watching the dark for the counterattacks Japanese doctrine favored after sundown. Offshore, Navy ships kept star shells and illumination rounds drifting over the lines through the night, throwing just enough light to catch movement without giving away exactly where a Marine was dug in. The first day at Iwo Jima cost roughly 2,000 American casualties before the sun went down, a number that made clear this was not going to be the short fight some planners had expected. It wasn't. That first night set the pattern for the 4 days that followed, as the divisions ashore fought their way toward the base of Mount Suribachi, the 600-foot volcanic cone dominating the southern tip of the island. Japanese artillery, positioned inside the mountain itself, could fire almost straight down onto the landing beaches, which made taking it the first real objective of the entire campaign. Tanks fitted with flame guns worked alongside the infantry to burn out cave positions the Japanese refused to abandon, one entrance at a time, while riflemen covered the approaches with the same rifles, grenades, and bayonets they'd carried off the beach on day one. It wasn't until the 23rd of February that a Marine patrol finally reached the summit and raised an American flag, an image that would outlive nearly everyone who fought that first morning. The island itself wouldn't be declared secure for another 3 weeks after that. By the time it was over, close to 7,000 Marines had been killed and roughly 20,000 more wounded. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders dug into that island, only a couple hundred were ever taken prisoner, the rest killed rather than surrender, following the same fight-to-the-death doctrine that had made every yard of ash and rock so costly to take in the first place. All of it on both sides started on a stretch of black sand that everything in this list was carried across on a single opening morning.